During my vacation, I met up with my cousin, Chris in Maine. Now, Chris has been interested in movies and movie making since we were kids. He had one of those old Super 8 cameras that he used early on in his movie-making fiascos. He has since moved on to VHS years ago and has been making tons of movies. As some of you know, I have a 15-month-old baby girl, so of course I had to buy a video camera, which I know little about. I was talking to my cousin about transferring the video from the small tapes in the camera to a full-size tape. As we discussed videotaping, I could help but to remind him of the camera buck. It took place maybe 5 years ago. As usual, my cousin didn't have a lot of time to hunt with us, so I was happy to see him show up one afternoon to go hunting with me. I started telling him about the rubs I had seen in a certain patch of woods earlier in the week. I had hunted along a brook, and it seemed like every other tree was trashed by this buck. The tracks in the mud were huge. It was apparent that this corker of a buck was rutting hard and hanging in the area. I wanted to go there with Chris, but he had his mind set that we should go to another spot, where he had shot and lost a 14-pointer years before. That story appears somewhere in the main forum. We drove into the spot where he wanted to go with me, talking all the way about the trees that were rubbed in the other area, how torn up they were, how huge the trees were, etc. Meanwhile, Chris is telling me about his new video camera, which he brought with him in a fanny pack. We finally parked the truck and started walking down an old Twitch road to a spot where we would head into the woods. Chris planned on heading in about 50 yards or so at that point. I would walk down the trail another 100 yards or so, and we would start still hunting in the same general direction. I had gone less than 50 yards when I started a deer off to my left. I caught a glimpse of brown and knew it was a big deer, but I didn't see the head. I ran into the woods a couple of yards to see if I could get a better look at him. I knew he wasn't sure what had spooked him because he didn't tear out of the area. It's our standard practice when we still hunt together, to fire into a tree if we jump a deer and it heads off in our partner's direction just to wake him up. But I knew this deer wasn't too spooked. He was in the section of woods we planned to hunt. Plus, I had just dropped Chris off at the corner. While I was trying to decide what to do, boom! My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Chris's 8mm. I thought to myself, good. That settles that, figuring the deer ran right up towards my cousin. Boom! Okay, I thought. So he had to fire a finishing shot. No big deal. Boom! Now I'm thinking, this isn't good. Boom! After waiting a few minutes, I made my way back up the trail to where Chris went in. I could see him, rifle in one hand, camcorder in the other, scanning the ground. I whistled to him and walked up to where he was. Looking for non-existent blood? I asked. Chris kind of grumbled and muttered something under his breath. Okay, I said. What happened? Chris told me that he walked into the woods and saw a huge tree that had cracked and fallen down from a past storm. After hearing about the giant buck rubs I had told him about on the ride in, he decided to have a little fun. Being a joker, he took his camcorder from his fanny pack and began filming the tree. While he was narrating some bullshit about how this was one of the trees that had been rubbed by a monster buck that I had been hunting all week. You know, kind of making fun of me. He stopped filming for a second and was trying to figure out what else he could film and joke about when he appeared. Jumped had indeed been a buck. A corker dandy of a buck, as my aunt would have said. The deer wasn't spooked, but he was traveling towards Chris with that gait those big bucks used to cover ground quickly. Chris told me afterward of seeing that big rack bob up and down as he closed the gap. Chris found himself in quite a predicament. He had his rifle in his right hand and his new camera in his left. He didn't want to drop his new camera, so he scooched, his word not mine, down real quick, set the camera down in the leaves and stood back up to bring his rifle into shooting position. The buck was less than 30 yards away when Chris scooched, and that deer didn't miss a beat before. He kicked in the afterburners. Chris emptied his gun at him, picking openings as he cruised right past him, and he never touched a hair. Needless to say, when we got back to camp, we didn't just cut his shirt tail, but we took half of the back of his shirt off and pinned it to the rafters, where it still hangs today. We were laughing with tears in our eyes as we reminisced about that day this past weekend. But I remember that he wasn't laughing much that day. I told him if he had been concentrating on hunting instead of trying to make fun of me, We could have filmed some excellent footage of him, admiring that big deer's rack. Instead of me laughing at him,